Risk management is a crucial organizational discipline designed to identify, assess, and mitigate potential risks that could threaten an organization's stability, growth, and resilience. In this episode, we'll gain unique insights from Douglas London, a retired CIA operations officer and 34-year veteran of the CIA's clandestine service. His extensive experience in identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities and weaknesses in collecting foreign intelligence uniquely positions him to provide insights into risk management. Mr. London is an adjunct associate professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service and is the author of The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence, and has written extensively for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and Politico. We'll discuss the primary risks leaders must focus on in today's fast-paced, interconnected world, and what Mr. London sees as practical, actionable strategies to help companies limit such threats. These strategies and others underscore the importance of ensuring that risk management remains proactive and integrated into an organization to stay ahead of today's ever-growing risks. Douglas, welcome to our podcast series.
Thanks, John. I'm glad to be here and talk to your audience today.
So Douglas, you've worked for the CIA and then you went on to become a successful author and consultant with a focus on risk management. Tell us about your journey, starting with the CIA, and what led you to work with companies and organizations about risks from a global to a local perspective.
Well, it was the early 80s for me when I was coming out of college, and I was very much interested in mission and giving back to service in some manner. And I was looking at the Marine Corps, which I did eventually join and served as an enlisted reservist, or the Foreign Service. But as circumstances turned out, it was the old days where the CIA came looking for you. My name was passed to them by a professor who had been a retired Foreign Service officer. And for the next 34 years, I had the great fortune of serving around the world, served more than 17 years abroad in the Middle East, South Asia, former Soviet republics, and Africa, and got to do a lot of great and satisfying things. At the end of my career, there's that transition period where you want to still feel like you're able to give back and do something. And I retired in 2019, and the world was just so different then than when I joined. I joined at the height of the Cold War in the 80s, but we were going through another, and I would say unique time where we were living in a day of hybrid warfare, where both state and non-state actors were using intelligence as a national instrument of power and targeting economic issues and topics and companies where particularly American companies were very vulnerable, the smallest companies to the largest, based on our place in the supply chain and how everything from economic sanctions to sabotage was an issue. And companies I found at that time had remained reliant on an old formula of a law enforcement approach. They had a lot of very smart senior former FBI people. They were looking at things criminally, but not from the perspective of intelligence. And I tried to start sort of sounding the alarm and offering a little bit of messaging on looking at the world and threats a little bit differently today.
It certainly is a different world. And by the way, what I found fascinating, recently I had a conversation with someone whose organization was hacked, and the hackers, by all appearances, seem to do this as a regular business. They have a customer service person, you deal with a negotiator, and it sounds like they're exceptionally organized. Is that what your experience shows?
It's much more institutional, right? A lot of these hackers, they still do have ties to state interests. We see a lot of cyber activity, malicious activity on an intelligence perspective being farmed out by professional intelligence services, looking towards the criminal world, but a much more, if you would, organized and institutionalized criminal world that is more efficient than it ever was before and enabled by state and non-state intel actors.
So even considering the cyber threat, but in your experience, so what are some of the top 3 or 4 risks, including cyber, obviously, that most organizations face?
I think if you look at what we've been experiencing over the last 2 to 5 years, I would start with sabotage. That would be physical, personal, from an IT perspective. It could be initiated by a lone wolf from within inside the company, an insider threat, or by a state and non-state actor. How many times are we seeing this kind of sabotage in areas of actual conflict, but well beyond, where American companies and oil companies have been hit and healthcare companies have been hit? I think obviously hacking and ransomware continues to be prevalent, and we're not going to see any end of that, where it's not just a criminal enterprise for money, but it's serving a political goal on the part of, China and Russia and Iran and North Korea. We're going to continue to see espionage in the context of the theft of intellectual property, whereas the United States is focused on collecting foreign intelligence to inform decision-making, what countries are going to do. We see the likes of Russia and China and Iran and North Korea trying to overcome sanctions and using it very much as a way to steal secure intellectual property to advance their own industries. For China, it's a cottage industry where it's actually required by the law that any Chinese enterprise or individual cooperates with the state in this fashion. And I think we also see the issue of optics, how important that is for companies doing business abroad, how the optics of their associations, particular governments or groups, can have an impact, can raise the threat for insider threat within their own enterprises, just based on the political climate. And that those optics, and depending on the opinions and thoughts and sentiments of a workforce, could actually enable the first three risks I was talking about in terms of sabotage, hacking, or the theft of intellectual property.
This sort of leads me to my next question, which is about several studies that have shown that small to medium-sized businesses especially have the highest risk of vulnerability to cyber threat and insider risk. And then today's organizational leaders are confronted with non-traditional employee relationships, especially with job hopping, remote workforce, and gig workers. So according to a recent Forbes article, more than half of U.S. workers are considering leaving their jobs this year. And other reports highlight that almost a third of those leaving jobs can still access the previous employer's systems. Companies just seem to fail to remove stale user accounts. In the context of cyber threat, what do you see are the biggest threats? And let's talk a little bit about the risk associated with disgruntled and fired employees. And it's perhaps the most overlooked threat to an organization.
Yeah, I think you hit it well there, John. You still see companies today thinking old thoughts, thinking old school, looking at their workforce, looking at the world from a perspective that's dated. Way back in the 80s, when I came into the agency, we were actually called career trainees. There was an expectation, not just in the U.S. government, but I think among private industry, that people were looking to spend a career with a company, with an outfit. And that's changed so much by the way the world economy has changed, by the gig economy of which you speak about. And I haven't seen companies quick enough to adapt and make this transition. So when you're looking at the threats, and again, your scope is so right that even small and medium-sized companies are being hit, and hit even worse probably than the bigger companies. So at least have, a bench. They have more resources to allocate to threat management than small companies who are not thinking about that their small cog could be held hostage in an economic standoff between the United States and China when it comes to tariffs, or become the target of hybrid warfare to undermine an American financial or economic interest. So I think companies really need to adapt. And one of the most important features of that adaptation, I think, starts with communications. I've seen a lack of effective communications among boards and then between companies and their workforce. I think today we can't function like we did even 5 years ago. The boards are going to need to talk more often. They're going to need to ask questions more regularly. They're going to need to communicate with their workforce, and they're going to need to secure buy-in from their workforce that the company's security is in their interest. And that extends to third-party risk. That extends to the gig workers, which now make up such a predominant part of their workforce, of their labor. If anything, there's a need to over-communicate, and there's certainly a need to document these communications so that teams within these companies are working synergistically and see the direction that they're being given, what the will of the company is to adjust and adapt to these threats. There's got to be more connectivity and communications between the corporate components, right? Like HR, security, IT, public relations, and the board. These different communities within a company can't operate in a vacuum. They can't just say, okay, these are my lanes of the road, and that's as far as they extend. When it comes to insider threat, an insider threat is going to be a feature of any external attack. As an intel officer, my money was made over looking for vulnerabilities within a company, within a government, within a ministry, and the vulnerabilities were people, largely. Beating a company technically often was best served by finding that backdoor through a person who is disgruntled or unhappy. For companies to have a better handle on these things, they've got to balance the environment they're looking to create for the workforce. They have to be very well aware of the optics, how they appear to their workforce based on where they are internationally. I mean, if you look at Elon Musk companies like SpaceX and Tesla and what have you, I mean, Mr. Musk is rather outspoken, and it could be rather antagonizing or provocative to folks inside his company, right? So the best defense for that is, again, going to be communications. If HR is looking at people who are having performance issues and talking to security who might see manifestations of that in their behavior, and IT who's effectively auditing, and then the PR people who are much more conscious of the company's image, right, and what it looks like outside and trying to create and affect that narrative, that's going to be a lot more effective for the board's use in coordinating. There's got to be a bit more constructive connectivity with the U.S. government. Now, I know there's those lines between private and public, but the U.S. government is really going out of its way to set up offices like the cyber infrastructure components in DHS and elsewhere to communicate with companies so that they're making companies aware of the threat. And then companies in turn are providing a great deal of guidance on what they're seeing and sometimes offering stupendous solutions. It's coming from the private sector as opposed to government institutions. And it's really enabling a partnership between the United States intelligence community and law enforcement and the private sector. And then lastly, and you hit on it, John, negligence. I think we're seeing a fair bit of problems coming up because companies, particularly those that can't afford the resources to put it towards oversight and put towards this synergistic response among, mature components, but are smaller companies, are having trouble in auditing and overseeing issues and then finding the right time and means of intervening.
Yeah, and it goes back to, I think, something that you focused on. It was certainly spot on, is that I don't think leaders are truly listening to the workforce. I found it very emblematic of that in the way whistleblowers have been coming forward and speaking now at congressional hearings. And again, the poster child for this of late has been Boeing. I mean, here was a storied company. That quality ran through the DNA of the organization. And then after an upheaval within management teams and selling off parts of the company to third parties to reduce expenses and prop up the stock prices, it didn't seem like they were living their values. And when you get disgruntled employees that come forward as whistleblowers, you know that there's an inherent issue with inside the organization. And leaders do have to make changes, right?
Well, absolutely. If your employees coming forward as whistleblowers, those are people who are at least confident enough they could speak up and not face retaliation, then I think mathematically you could expect that there's a lot more disgruntled employees within. One of the issues, and you're raising it, John, as well, and some of these examples, is I find that companies still tend to be more reactive than proactive, right? It's like, okay, closing the barn doors after the horses are out, right? There's got to be an institutional approach, a very premeditated concept to what your relationship is going to be between management and the workforce, and trying to strive for wellness and a positive environment without losing performance, right? And that's something that it's not impossible to achieve, but incredibly necessary. And when you look at the political environment we're in, just look at the United States itself, where there's such toxic divides. Now, you factor that internationally and it multiplies. And companies are finding themselves immersed more in international politics based on to whom they're selling, with whom they're working, what their third party is looking like, right? And the products and sometimes the particular products they provide. So at the risk of sounding, like all, well, let's just play kumbaya together, wellness really is important. Again, I was the fox looking to get into the chicken coop. So, I was the predator. And what I was looking for was I was looking to exploit, manipulate, and exacerbate the toxic work environments that people had. So when I was looking to go after a government, I was looking to go after the Russians and the FSB, I was looking for disgruntled employees. There's things that companies can do to mitigate that and to sort of undermine the predator and the opportunities they have. And part of it is just trying to secure that buy-in from the employees, showing real tangible consequences to staff and the dangers of hybrid warfare and governments, and that employees have a stock in it, and that it's not just Big Brother looking over your shoulder when we have these various audit systems, but very genuinely trying to protect you as well. And I think at a minimum, the effort itself pays dividends. The effort itself makes it harder for the predator to take advantage when people feel like somebody's listening to me, somebody values me. Because I will tell you, my years targeting people, targeting agents to spy on their countries, I was looking for people who felt they were at the end of their rope, that they had no place else to turn, that there was a precipitating crisis where I could come in and be of help or assistance or what have you. There's things companies can do to mitigate against that, to make it harder for the predator and make their employees feel, even the gig employees, a bit more bought into the process.
What I find amazing is, and it's certainly not a new concept, it's an old concept, is what you're describing builds loyalty, builds worker satisfaction, builds productivity. People who are happy at their jobs, who understand that they have a voice within the organization, are generally more productive and more willing to step up and share new ideas, enhances innovation. An interesting point about all of this, though, is that I happened to attend a recent webinar, and the topic was on trade secrets. Now, many companies, obviously, they file patents to protect their intellectual property, but they have a lot of underlying assets, which are trade secrets, whether that's a customer list, whether that's a supplier list, whether that's a specific formula in the way something is made. We've always heard about that secret formula that Coca-Cola has, right? Locked in a safe somewhere in Atlanta, I believe. It's amazing how many companies don't truly understand that they have a lot of intellectual property in this form of trade secrets they don't seem to protect.
Well, again, that gets back to that reactive nature that I've seen, particularly since I've, retired and started working with companies and, sitting and listening to them and hearing them out. I mean, that's the first place you start, right? What do you think your issues are? What do you think your problems are? And then trying to sort of expand the conversation. Because when you look at things that, the Russians and the Chinese have been after, I mean, it was just a few years ago that a bunch of Iowa farmers found some strange, activity in the fields of people digging things up. The FBI got involved, and these were members of Chinese companies, agricultural firms, some of whom were working with American companies for short periods of time as part of an exchange, and they were stealing seeds that had a proprietary formula to reverse engineer. I don't know yet that companies are sufficiently kind of aware. Our adversaries aren't just looking for, how we make rockets and bombs and tanks. They're looking for how we affect our infrastructure, how we manage our personnel systems, everything in terms of infrastructure is a valid target for them, as well as all this proprietary information, even of the most basic natures. I think awareness is a big part of it, coming to understand the depth, extent, and audacity of the threat. Because I mentioned it earlier, for China particularly, it is a virtual cottage industry. The volume of which they attack American enterprises for these very trade secrets that companies don't even realize necessarily are all that important to them, spectacularly important for China. I think awareness is a really important part that will help companies sort of come up with better defenses. And again, secure the buy-in of their workforce, where that collaboration is not Big Brother, but it's really in everybody's interest.
It's interesting that I had a conversation with an analyst that works for a red team, blue team company, and they go in and they look for vulnerabilities within systems. That's their job to find them. And when I said, well, what do you find is the single biggest point of vulnerability? And he goes, number one, it's people. They're curious. They get something. People that send out phishing emails, they're very sophisticated. They're very intriguing, and people can't help themselves, and they just don't understand the risks. And I think that brings me to the question I seem to be posing to virtually every guest I have, and that is the impact of AI. And what I wanted to get your perspective is that, and again, many companies, and I think most companies see both sides of it, that there is amazing potential and incredible risks at the same time.
Yeah, and you actually were going down that road yourself, John, so I'm going to pick up on the trail you left before. What AI is doing, many things it's doing for a targeting enterprise, it's allowing a very sophisticated, very expeditious look at people, right? The kind of targeting packages you could take from a person's social footprint, what they look like on media, what they look like in the workplace. Every place that information can be gathered, from credit scores and taxes and property information, and all that's pulled together, and people's bills and such. So much of it is available legally, and then a great deal of it is stolen and able to be secured, if you would, on the dark web. So from a targeting perspective alone, AI has become an enormous force multiplier for a state enterprise, non-state enterprise, criminal network to go ahead and target people. And think about what AI requires. It requires communications. AI works as effectively as it's fed. So it requires companies, individuals, whatever, to feed it data, because that's what AI needs. The more data you feed in, well, that's great, but there's sort of a double-edged sword, because you're now offering more vulnerabilities. There's more data out there that's being crunched by the AI. There's more data out there that the AI itself could be manipulated by, an external player taking advantage of those lines of communication and the data it's being fed to increase its targeting, to look for those vulnerabilities. So that by the time you look at that human factor, which absolutely right, what your contacts and friends are telling you, NSA is an amazing organization and they can crunch algorithms. But if I can simply get somebody on the inside to give us a backdoor into a server, that's a hell of a lot easier, a hell of a lot quicker. And it's going to be a lot more effective with less of a trail. That's what AI is doing for us, because it's allowing, targeting enterprise to enhance their ability to find, locate, and communicate with the right people and turn those screws in the right way to get the spigots turned on, which, great for our enemies, really bad and scary for us.
It truly is. And I was chatting with a company executive and getting ready for our interview today. I talked to him a little bit about a process that many companies don't do effectively, and that's called offboarding. We onboard employees pretty well in most companies, whether it's through training, rules and regulations, and what's our culture like, and blah, blah, blah. And then when they leave, I think we fail to do a lot of the things that we should be doing, including that the importance of an exit interview, the importance of IT's participation in the process, turning off passcodes, understanding that you're vulnerable not only from an IT perspective, but also from a physical security perspective. You're probably witnessing more companies putting a lot more effort into, when someone leaves, how are we closing the door behind them?
Yeah, John, I mean, as an intel officer, as a former spy, I can't tell you how important formers are of any target that one's pursuing, because formers enable you to understand, to map out the target much more effectively. And they're often much more free and liberal to speak, either because they've had a negative experience or they don't feel any bonds, any requirements of loyalty, or that they're bound by, unless they have an NDA, to protect the company's interests. So exit interviews are a really important part, just to kind of take the pulse of the people and to try to leave them with a good taste in their mouth. But again, we get back to that integration of components where you need HR and security and IT and P and PR all talking to each other to, one, assure from sort of that list of due diligence, we've taken back ID codes, we've taken back ID cards, we've ended access, they can't get on, but also to make sure that these people feel that they're not being left out to drift. Companies think, okay, this is expensive, but if they continue to have some sort of help hotline, some sort of umbilical cord that, hey, and if you need to check on your past benefits or get a reference or whatever, we're here for you, contact us. So there's still some connected tissue. That's not just a wellness thing. That's not just a mentality thing, but that's also something tangible. It's a two-way street, and it allows companies to have some connectivity that bounds the former employees somewhat, and also leaves a line of communications if they are approached, if somebody comes down to them, because it's not like, oh, we're warning you that if you do this and this, once you leave, we want to help you. You were an important part of this team. We're sorry to see you go, but, if there's ever anything, somebody approaches you, whatever like that, please do come to us, because we want to be able to help you. That's not very hard or very expensive to do. And it continues to make former employees a stakeholder of sort, that there's some benefit to them by maintaining that connectivity, and it allows some continued insight for the company. And it pays off if just one or two people come back and go, hey, you told me, and I had this funny approach from this, company in China. I mean, it's already paid for itself right then and there, not very costly. And I think it's also going to leave employees with a bit of a better feeling where they have some mutual sense of obligation to their former employer.
I have to tell you, Douglas, that is so brilliant and insightful, because even the person I spoke with who runs a fairly large organization, that did not come up when we talked about offboarding. Keeping that, as you called it, that connective tissue with a former employee. Hey, a lot of companies will hire people back because oftentimes people are let go maybe because of economic reasons. And then when things reinvigorate, they're brought back. So yeah, I think there's a positive outcome across the board, including, as you said, you don't want to make that employee feel like they're left adrift. As we wrap up here, what one word describes who you are?
Well, the cool side of me would like to think it'd be spy, but the reality is educator. That's what a spy also does. A spy educates, a spy informs, the spy contributes, right? So I'd like to think in this new chapter of my life, it's about educating companies, educating people, educating students. And I think that gives me a great deal of personal satisfaction that I'm still able to make some sort of positive contribution.
That's brilliant. Douglas, thank you so much for your time today. And I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. Thanks so much.
Entirely my pleasure.
During the course of our conversation, Douglas discussed some of the top threats and risks organizational leaders should focus on. For example, hacking and ransomware, both the criminal and state-sponsored cyber threats. Sabotage in physical, personal, or IT-related forms that can originate from within the company or from external sources is a risk that all global enterprises must prepare for. Espionage, the stealing of intellectual property and trade secrets. Third-party risk. And by the way, this goes beyond dealing just with small and medium-sized companies. For example, Russian hackers injected malware into SolarWinds Orion software, compromising thousands of organizations' network systems and data. And certainly that's a very large organization. But again, it's a third-party risk. And within all these threats, AI has emerged as what Douglas described as an enormous force multiplier for state-backed and criminal networks to target people and organizations, significantly amplifying the risks. We spent a lot of time discussing the risk from disgruntled and fired employees. As mentioned, Douglas spent decades working for the CIA to gather foreign intelligence, often looking for vulnerabilities, and people were the most significant ones. Based on his experience, he provided strategies to help mitigate this threat, including the need for companies to create a positive and open environment between management and the workforce. This makes it harder for predators to take advantage when people feel like somebody's listening and values them. Leaders must understand that the traditional employer-employee relationship has changed as we now have a remote workforce, gig workers, and independent contractors with access to systems and sensitive information. This requires a shift in strategy and investment to protect enterprise networks and operations. Douglas emphasized the importance of the exit interview during the offboarding process. Yes, removing an employee's system's passwords, facility access, and taking back ID cards is essential. But don't allow them to feel as though they've been set adrift. An essential aspect of the exit interview is to leave their ability to communicate openly as they transition to a new employer. They should call if they need a reference or if anyone approaches them for insider information about the company. This allows ex-employees to remain connected with the organization. And the one word Douglas used to describe himself is educate. Yes, he was a spy, but he considers his career to be one of educating and informing others. He finds great satisfaction in using his experience to inform and educate companies, people, and students to protect themselves and their organizations against the pervasive threats confronting all of us. We are deeply grateful to Douglas for generously sharing his knowledge, experience, and valuable insights. This podcast is executive produced by John Rebecchi and the New York Institute of Technology in conjunction with the School of Management and the Office of Strategic Communications and External Affairs. Our co-executive producer is Dr. Deborah Cohn, Professor of Marketing at the School of Management. Our social media strategist and producer is Patthara Chandaragga, and our audio editor and mixer is Brian Falk from Abacus Entertainment. Special thanks to Professor Ellie Schwartz and John Rebecchi from the Office of Development and Alumni Relations for all their support. Until next time.